Picture this. You're a government minister in Europe. Your legal team has just told you the United States is threatening sanctions if you don't play ball on some foreign policy nonsense. At the same time, every email you've ever sent, every Teams chat slagging off foreign leaders, every cabinet document draft, all of it lives on Microsoft 365 or Google's servers, under the jurisdiction of the very country twisting your arm. And you know, in the back of your mind, that with the right piece of American legislation, a court order, and a polite knock on the right cloud provider's door, Washington could ask for a peek. Maybe at you, maybe at your colleagues, maybe at your voters.
The reality is, that's not science fiction. We watched the United States threaten European officials with sanctions. We watched a neutral country, Switzerland, look at that picture and say, we're not comfortable with a US company holding our most sensitive data. And they weren't talking about email. They were talking about Palantir, a company that received its first significant external funding from the CIA's venture arm, In-Q-Tel, after every conventional investor said no, and whose earliest serious users were American intelligence agencies. That's not incidental history. That's baked into what the company is. Switzerland's military ran a detailed risk assessment in 2024 on Palantir's software. They concluded that data held by Palantir could be accessed by the American government and intelligence services, and that leaks from Palantir's systems cannot be technically prevented. Their recommendation was blunt. The Swiss Army should look for alternatives. Neutral Switzerland quietly walked away.
Meanwhile, here in the UK, we didn't just stroll towards Palantir, we handed them the bloody keys to the building. More than 900 million quid in contracts, NHS patient data platform, Ministry of Defence decision systems, bits of policing, nuclear weapons support, border planning. Now, to be fair, the NHS Federated Data Platform did go through a formal open tender, but the December 2025 MOD deal, worth £240 million, direct award, no competition, and Parliament is still asking why it was handed over without one. Loads of black ink over the contract pages either way. That's not, we bought a tool, that's, we've built a dependency. So here's the question I want you to sit with, as the owner of a 50-person firm or the chair of a charity board. If governments are getting antsy about US vendors having that kind of leverage over their health systems, militaries, even their nukes, why are you still treating Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, and every other US SaaS in your stack as just the office tools? What if, in the next political circus across the Atlantic, your business is the bit sitting between President whoever and your data? This isn't about tinfoil hats. It's about power, law, and where your data actually lives. And it absolutely affects you, even if all you think you do is send invoices and keep donor lists.
Right, hold that thought, because once you see this, you can't unsee it.
You're listening to the Small Business Cybersecurity Guy. I'm Noel Bradford, with 40-odd plus years in the trenches, from tape backups to cloud bollocks, here to stop your business getting shafted by computers, crooks, or clueless vendors. Today, we're talking about why your little company is now sitting on top of US political risk, whether you like it or not. And to keep me honest, I've got the usual suspects. Our recent addition to the team, Corinne Jefferson, ex-US intelligence, now trying very hard not to say "I told you so" from a flat in London.
I worked in cybersecurity for the US government. The specific organizational chart isn't particularly relevant to today's threat discussion. What matters is, from an intelligence perspective, Palantir is not your average software vendor.
And Movin McLeod, who spent decades cleaning up after terrible IT decisions, usually with better humour than I manage.
I brought some biscuits and plenty of sarcasm. It helps the medicine go down.
And Graham Faulkner, whose voice makes all this doom sound strangely classy.
I'll try not to narrate the end of the world, just the interesting bits.
Let's tighten the focus. Palantir was founded in 2003 by Peter Thiel and others, with about $2 million of early funding from the CIA's venture arm after conventional investors said no. Its first serious users were intelligence agencies. Its core platform, Gotham, was literally shaped through iterative collaboration with people inside that community. This was designed from the outset as an intelligence-grade data fusion and targeting tool. Over time, Palantir added Foundry, the civilian platform. That's what underpins the NHS Federated Data Platform. But the DNA is the same. Ingest everything, build a unified model of people, places, events, and use that to drive decisions. The UK has now put Palantir in the middle of the NHS, the MOD, parts of policing, nuclear weapons support, and border planning. The contract total that's on record is over £900 million. Realistically, it's probably higher.
And just to be clear, we're not reading their marketing brochure here. This is the same Palantir that's been tied into US immigration enforcement systems and secret predictive policing pilots, and that once failed a pen test so badly the testers got complete control of their internal network. That's who's sitting on your and your nan's hospital data.
Now contrast that with Switzerland. Over roughly 7 years, at least 9 Swiss federal agencies either refused or quietly declined Palantir. The Swiss Armed Forces commissioned a 20-page risk assessment of Palantir's logistics module. The evaluators highlighted several things. First, because Palantir is a US-headquartered company, its data is potentially reachable by American government and intelligence services. They explicitly reference that as a sovereignty problem. Second, they judge that leaks from Palantir's systems cannot be technically prevented. That's an architectural issue, not just a policy one. Third, they warn that the Army would become dependent on Palantir specialists on site, which could limit the Army's ability to act in a crisis. Classic vendor lock-in. Their recommendation to the Army chief was unambiguous: consider alternatives. Switzerland then set a direction towards absolute autonomy. Swiss servers, Swiss encryption, Swiss cloud, Swiss AI.
So, neutral Switzerland looks at the same company we've just stuffed into the NHS and the MOD and says, no thanks, too much US leverage, too much lock-in, too much architectural risk. The UK looks at it and says, hold my beer, let's give them health, defence, police and nukes. If you run a business here, that divergence should be setting off sirens about how we treat US vendors generally.
Let's step back and widen the camera. Because Palantir is the sharp, dramatic example, but it's not the only story. Over the last decade, European governments have been forced to ask a very uncomfortable question. What happens when the politics in Washington turn and almost all your digital nervous system runs on American platforms?
Think back to the first term of the Trump administration. We saw European officials threatened with sanctions, threats to companies over pipelines. They lent on allies over trade, the whole lot. Whether you think that was justified or not isn't the point. The point is, if they're willing to play hardball on politics, do you honestly think they'll get squeamish about leaning on a US tech giant if it helps them? And this time round, shall we just say Greenland, Ukraine and Venezuela, to name a few?
From an intelligence perspective, you always look at capability, intent, and opportunity. Capability. U.S. law already gives American authorities reach into data held by U.S. companies, even when the servers are abroad. We'll come to the Cloud Act in a moment. Intent. We've seen a willingness to use economic pressure and sanctions tools against allies. Opportunity. Most European governments, agencies, and businesses have consolidated email, documents, and collaboration onto Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace. The choke points are obvious.
And you can see the penny dropping. You've got big European institutions quietly trialling alternatives, or at least trying to de-Microsoft a few critical bits. Ministries asking, do we really want our crown jewel data on a stack where a foreign court can, in theory, demand it? They're not binning Outlook tomorrow, but the mindset has shifted from these tools are just plumbing to this is a strategic dependency with political strings attached.
I talk to IT folk in councils, NHS trusts, bits of central government. Nobody is under the illusion they can just rip out Microsoft 365 by Friday. It's too embedded. But the serious ones are quietly asking 3 questions. Where are our absolute red line datasets? Who actually controls the keys? And how the hell do we get an exit plan that doesn't involve a decade-long migraine?
Because when you combine what Corinne described with Palantir, deep integration into defence, health, policing, with the fact that the rest of the state runs on US office suites. You don't merely have cloud vendors. You have a structural reliance on another country's legal system and political mood.
And if you're listening to this as a small business owner thinking, oh, shut up, that's governments, not me, here's the hard truth. Your business has made the same bet. You've put email, documents, calendars, chat, maybe your CRM and help desk onto the same US platforms. Not because you love America, but because that's where the tools are. Fair enough. But pretending it's neutral plumbing is where you get hurt.
So the SME takeaway right now, nobody is saying ban Microsoft or delete Google. That's not happening next week. And frankly, you probably couldn't operate if it did. But those platforms have moved from safe default to strategic dependency with legal and political strings. If governments are finally clocking that, you'd better believe it matters for your 50-person firm as well. Right, let's talk about the bit the lawyers love to overcomplicate. Who can actually force your cloud provider to hand over data? We'll keep this human. The US Cloud Act. Sounds fluffy. It isn't.
To be technically precise, the Cloud Act says if a company is subject to U.S. jurisdiction, it can be compelled by a U.S. court to preserve or disclose data, regardless of whether that data is stored inside or outside the United States. So if you're a UK business using a US headquartered provider, Microsoft, Google, a US CRM, whatever, the fact your data lives in a UK data center does not magically keep it out of reach of US legal process.
Think of it like this. Your files might be in a warehouse in London, but the landlord is American, and American courts can make the landlord open the door. The label on the warehouse doesn't change who the landlord answers to.
Now add encryption. Everyone loves to say, it's encrypted, so it's safe. Sure, but who holds the bloody keys? Take BitLocker on Windows devices. If you just click Next, Next, Finish in a Microsoft 365 world, chances are your recovery keys end up escrowed in Azure AD, tied to your tenant. In some scenarios, like certain managed services or consumer accounts, Microsoft can see enough to help reset or recover. If a provider can help you get your data back when you've locked yourself out, that usually means they can also be compelled to help someone else get your data when you'd rather they didn't. The technical details vary, but that's the principle. Where you fully control your own keys, proper customer managed key setups, hardware tokens locked in your safe, forcing Microsoft alone achieves nothing. Where Microsoft or another US provider has practical access to decryption material, the Cloud Act bite is much nastier.
From a legal conflict perspective, it's messy. UK GDPR, and before that, EU GDPR, say you can't just ship personal data off to foreign authorities because another country asks nicely. There's a whole structure about international transfers, adequacy, safeguards. Article 48 explicitly says foreign court orders don't automatically make a transfer lawful. At the same time, Section 26 of the UK's Data Protection Act gives big exemptions for national security and defense. So a UK organization using a US vendor can end up in a double bind. A US court order under the Cloud Act saying, hand this over, and UK data protection rules saying, do not hand this over unless you want a regulatory problem. There is no tested, clean answer yet. We do not have a nice court case that settles this, which means, from a risk standpoint, it's an unquantified exposure sitting in the middle of your stack.
This is where I look boards in the eye and say, look, if your whole environment is Microsoft manages everything, including the keys, then in practical terms, you've outsourced not just your IT, but a chunk of your legal risk to someone who answers to a different legal system. It doesn't mean the NSA is snooping your timesheets. It does mean you can't pretend you're fully in control of who could, in theory, compel access.
And that's the bit most small businesses and charities have never even been told. You're making choices about encryption, backups, and SaaS on the basis of price and convenience, when actually you're also deciding which court system can lean on your data. That's not paranoia. That's literally how the law is written.
At this point, you might be thinking, all right, this all sounds a bit dramatic. We're a 50-person engineering firm in Leeds, not a spy agency. Why should we care?
So let's dial it down a notch. No, You are not getting a midnight knock from the NSA because you sell widgets or run a homelessness charity. You are not suddenly the target of shadowy foreign powers. But your critical business and client data absolutely flows through these US-controlled choke points. That's just boring operational reality.
Let's list it. You've probably got Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace for email, docs, calendars, chat. Maybe a US-based CRM for your customers or donors. A US ticketing system for your help desk. Some backup tool that quietly pushes copies of everything to a US-owned cloud. Monitoring agents on servers phoning home to a platform in the States. You didn't set out to build US-centric infrastructure. You just bought what was on page 1 of Google.
In intelligence terms, you've created multiple single points of foreign legal control. If one provider is compelled to hand over data, it doesn't just see a few emails. It can see contracts, internal disputes, merger discussions, staff disciplinary notes, details of vulnerable service users, whatever lives in that platform. For a charity handling sensitive case files or a professional firm with client confidentiality obligations, that's not a trivial concern.
Regulators are slowly waking up to this. Under UK GDPR, you're supposed to understand where personal data goes, including international transfers and the risks involved. If you've signed contracts promising clients, we'll keep your data in the UK, and you're stuffing it into a US-owned SaaS where the Cloud Act might apply, you've potentially just lied to them, even if you didn't mean to. The ICO doesn't care if you were confused by the marketing.
And then there's reputation. Imagine the headline. Local charity can't explain where vulnerable client data really lives. Or, supply to NHS had no idea US law might touch patient-related data they process. You don't need a breach for that to look horrible. All it takes is an awkward parliamentary question or a journalist with time on their hands.
From a governance perspective, this is now a board-level risk. It sits alongside things like financial solvency and health and safety. Directors are expected to at least ask, what are our data sovereignty exposures? Do we understand our reliance on foreign jurisdiction vendors? Do we have any high-sensitivity data in systems where we don't control the keys? Not every board needs to become expert, but we never discussed it is not a strong defense.
So no, don't panic. Keep sending your invoices, keep scheduling your rotas. But stop pretending your cloud stack is just stationary. It's become intertwined with international law and geopolitical mood swings. If you ignore that, you're not being pragmatic, you're being reckless. The good news is, you can do something about it without binning everything and moving back to paper files. Let's get practical. I'm not telling you to rip out Microsoft 365, burn your laptops, and move into a bunker. I like Teams about as much as the next grumpy sysadmin, but we live in the real world. What I am saying is, treat US vendors as an explicit, manageable risk, not invisible plumbing.
Step 1. Do a simple Cloud Act exposure audit. Nothing fancy. Grab a whiteboard or a spreadsheet. List your core systems: email, documents, CRM, finance, HR, backups, monitoring, anything touching client or staff data. Next to each, write the vendor, where they're headquartered, and where the data is stored if you know it. If the company's American or owned by one, highlight it. You'll probably end up with a sea of US flags. That's fine. The point isn't to freak out. It's to see the water you're swimming in.
Step 2. Identify your crown jewels. That might be patient-like data if you're a care provider, donor and beneficiary records for a charity, confidential client files for a law firm, intellectual property or bid documents for an engineering company. In practical terms, ask, if this dataset were exposed or mishandled, what would actually hurt us the most? Legally, financially, reputationally?
Step 3. Decide what can stay where it is and what deserves extra protection. For normal office chatter and calendar invites, Microsoft 365 is probably fine. Just lock it down properly. For crown jewel data, you've got options. Maybe that lives in an EU-based system with strong encryption and customer-managed keys. Maybe you split especially sensitive fields into a separate store that never touches US infrastructure.
Fold this into your DPIAs and procurement, but in plain English. When you're assessing a new tool, ask, where are the servers? Who owns the company? Who actually controls the encryption keys? If we needed to leave in 12 months, could we? Those aren't trick questions. A decent vendor should be able to answer without hand-waving.
From a threat intelligence angle, I'd add one thing. Assume that dependencies will eventually be tested. Maybe by politics, maybe by law, maybe by a breach. Building optionality now, meaning realistic exit plans, diversified providers, clear key management, reduces your blast radius when, not if, something shifts.
For the board slide deck, keep it brutally simple. US vendors aren't evil, they're just bound by US law. That creates a risk we can't contract away. Our job is to know where we depend on them, keep routine stuff there if it makes sense, and move or harden the truly sensitive bits. Also, pay attention to where public sector procurement is going. As European governments demand more data sovereign solutions, being the supplier who already understands this and has options will win you business.
So, what if your business really does sit between Washington and your data? The answer shouldn't be panic. It should be, we've mapped it, we've made conscious choices, and we have a way out if we need one.
Start small. Do the audit. Mark the crown jewels. Ask one awkward question in your next vendor call. That's it. Forward motion.
And remember, some doors stay closed for a reason. You don't have to tell your customers every gory technical detail. You do need to be confident that if someone asks hard questions about your data sovereignty, you can answer without flinching.
We'll leave it there. Corinne, Morven, Graham, thanks for keeping this only moderately terrifying.
Always a pleasure to narrate the apocalypse lightly.
And if you're doing that audit over a cuppa, think of us.
When I say this is serious, I mean it. But it's also solvable. Start now.
All right, that's it for this episode of the Small Business Cybersecurity Guy. Look after your data, look after your people, and try not to sign any more blind dependencies than you already have. We'll be back next time. Cheers.
From an intelligence perspective, you always look at capability, intent, and opportunity. Capability. U.S. law already gives American authorities reach into data held by U.S. companies, even when the servers are abroad. We'll come to the Cloud Act in a moment. Intent. We've seen a willingness to use economic pressure and sanctions tools against allies. Opportunity. Most European governments, agencies, and businesses have consolidated email, documents, and collaboration onto Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace. The choke points are obvious.
And to keep me honest, I've got the usual suspects. Corinne Jefferson, ex-US intelligence, now trying very hard not to say, "I told you so," from a flat in London. And Graham Faulkner, whose voice makes all this doom sound strangely classy. Whether you think that was justified or not isn't the point. The point is, if they're willing to play hardball on politics, do you honestly think they'll get squeamish about leaning on a US tech giant if it helps them? And this time round, shall we just say Greenland, Ukraine, and Venezuela, to name a few?